So I'm going to present to you, take you through really quickly a project that we've been working on for about 6 months. Started about 6 months ago, and we recently ran a program under the cooperative farming, federally funded cooperative farming program that the BCCM is running. And so it's around a protected habitat farmers mutual. So that's us. You don't need to hear about us. And in essence, the idea that we were exploring is how can we reward farmers for good stewardship. So, like, order of magnitude, half of Australia's land mass is privately owned, farmed, and the impact of that of farmers on the environment there is significant, particularly given that that's the the more productive parts of the Australian landscape as well. And so what we began wanting to explore is how we can go about rewarding farmers for good stewardship. Through the course, we started the course, there was a case study that kind of brings this to life in the sense of how do you go about providing farmers financial benefits for providing good stewardship. And there's a lady called Clarke who has a 2,500 hectare property around about Holbrook. And she put a conservation covenant on a third of her property, which had some box wood gum that are threatened species. And in doing so, she permanently protected that habitat. And what she was able to do with the support of the National Conservation Trust is actually be able to qualify for carbon credits. And she was able to generate roughly $270,000 through the sale of those carbon credits, through the protection of this land and through planting trees around that land. So it was fenced off, and there were some trees that were created. And so in doing so, she was actually able to generate a net financial benefit from the carbon credits, notwithstanding the fact that in valuing this farm pre and post putting on this permanent covenant, there was a conceptual diminution in value of 180,000. So the idea that she'd sold her rights to cut down those trees and farm it intensively was going to cost her 180,000 according to the property valuer. So the point being that, like, she was able to generate a net financial kind of outcome through the generation of these environmental benefits, and in addition to that, she's been able to sustainably graze on that land. So she has sheep and beef, cattle that go through that land, and she's been able to actually sell under a premium brand. So premium brands for both her wool and beef. So she sells under Cape Grim and through a superfine merino brand. So that kind of demonstrates there's two ways that farmers can be rewarded. One through a consumer brand, in the sense of the consumer appetite for supporting protecting this type of environmental actions, and through carbon markets. And so that's effectively what we're seeking to explore. How can we help farmers to access those two types of markets? And the challenge is that the way that the agricultural system is set up is that production is very clearly a priority for farmers. The environmental market in particular is incredibly confusing and complex, and the brokers that operate in that market are expensive. And so what a farmers mutual does is enables farmers to come together to actually address this kind of market failure. And in essence, the key driver to begin with is the fact that brokers in the environmental markets currently charge anywhere from 30 to 40% of the revenues generated through environmental markets. So which represents the fact that it's an immature and emerging market, and they're effectively taking over the odds type returns for their efforts. And so by farmers coming together through a mutual, they can aggregate their market power and radically reduce those transaction costs, effectively disintermediate the brokers, and introduce a kind of a pacemaker co-op. And so our expectation is that, like through this aggregation and this creation of this mutual infrastructure, we'll be able to reduce those costs down to more like 10% of the value being generated. So more of the value of the environmental benefits go to the farmers. And there's other benefits as well. Once you've created a mutual, which is often the case, that mutuals start where there's a market failure, and then once people come together, they begin to realise that there's other things they can do. And so we can see that there will be other opportunities for farmers to digitise these contracts and to be rewarded for other things over and above environmental markets. The other part to it is that the creation of the brand. So that's an example of, for example, we might be able to trace provenance, that like Claire Cannon's beef will be able to be traced to plate, or someone's grapes grown in McLaren Vale be able to be traced all the way through to China. And so we've through the program we ran with BCCM, we had someone, a product markets, a branding specialist, come along, and they pointed out very clearly that there is an opportunity in this protected habitat space. And they took us through the top 20 consumer brands with respect to the environment. And they said, yes, there is demand for this type of product, and that the climate was pre-COVID the #1 issue for consumers. And consumers don't understand carbon markets, but they do understand planting trees. But their emotional attachment is through protecting effectively furry creatures. So the animals that live in our habitat, and the key objective of this kind of activity is to actually protect biodiversity ultimately. So the Farmers Mutual is a proven model for delivering this type of activity in the agricultural space, as we well know. And from there, so there's effectively two things we're asking farmers to do in order to create this mutual. One is that with respect to every piece of land, there would be some part of that land that would be protected, and they would enter into a contractual arrangement with respect to that land that would obligate them to look after that land from an environmental perspective. And the other really key part that came through, that merged through this program we ran, is that by having a mutual, farmers agreed to become a member of the mutual and agreed to the terms of the mutual. And this idea of allows for setting a peer best practice. So it's more of a peer-to-peer led, farmer-led approach than a regulatory-led approach with respect to environmental stewardship. And you can imagine that when talking to governments about that, they've responded incredibly favourably. The idea that the farmer industry is creating the benchmark, and then policy and regulation can fall in behind. So that's what a stewardship agreement is. It can be a term or permanent agreement. It can relate to conservation or regeneration, and it'll leverage existing infrastructure. So there's land trusts currently in each state, for example, that are counterparties with respect to permanent agreements. And one of the things that's come through this is that, by being farmer-led, it changes the focus. So currently the focus of environmental markets is really driven by the broking side, and that's, if you go onto someone like Green Collar's website, you'll see that they talk about methodologies. So it's very much the language of how we're going to go about monetising these benefits. Whereas starting from the farmer side, you start hearing things like, well, how can we actually enhance dams to deliver these outcomes? So for example, there's a lot of work being done by the ANU Sustainable Farms Unit about how creating protected habitat around or regenerating dam landscapes can deliver biodiversity benefits, it can deliver carbon benefits, and it can also deliver mental health benefits to the farmers, because they look upon this oasis that that's sitting within this these very parched landscapes. So the idea that there's trees and a thriving ecosystem on their farm around the dam is a benefit. So what we're about here is unlocking this market, unlocking the environment benefits for consumers. This is very much about creating a farmer-led process, And so what we're currently doing is that we ran this first program, and we had 30 odd farmers and conservation groups primarily involved. We're currently recruiting, well, we've set ourselves a minimum target of recruiting 50 farmers to be the founding farmer group, to create the kind of the steering committee to drive this thing forward. The feedback we've had from everyone from the National Farmers Federation to Landcare Vic and New South Wales, particular Landcare groups, Australian Organics, organic farmers are already setting aside 5% of their farm for biodiversity. So they see it as something that like fits completely hand in glove with what they're already doing. So we have this process where we're hoping to have this in place to have something in place and operational by the September, optimistically, next year. And that's it. Hopefully that made enough sense. I'll be interested to see what people think.